Hi, I'm Sharad Kuttan and welcome to Consider This. Tonight we take on the question of the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030 document just released by the government of the day. To help me understand this better, I have with me Terence Gomez, the Professor of Political Economy at the Faculty of Economics and Administration at the University of Malaya, as well as Idlan Zakaria. She's the CEO of the Centre. She is also a senior lecturer in accounting with Birmingham University. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining me. Let me give this question first to Idlan. When you read this, when it first came out, what did you make of it? What is it that you thought this document was designed to do?
Thank you, Sharad, for that question. The first thing I suppose that struck me with this is the idea of a shared and the prosperity aspect, the shared aspect. Because the moment that it came out as shared, it meant for me, this is for everybody. So this is not just a policy document for the policymakers, it is something that's got to be embodied by everybody, including your man on the street and your workers in the corridors of Putrajaya.
Okay, well, and Terence, your first thought? I mean, you've seen much of this coming out. We've had other visions before, sometimes blurred. What do you make of it?
Well, first I must say, when I read it, I was shocked at its honesty. It talked about the fact that let me go through some of them. The economic growth potential was not there. Industries have low value added, low adoption of technology. The Bumiputra economy is not expanding. Corruption is endemic. Monopoly and market profiteering. I was taken aback.
By the honesty?
By the honesty of the document. But I was even more taken aback by the fact that when I looked at it and the more I got into it, I felt this is taking me back to the NEP, the new economic policy. Since you asked me to talk about it in terms of previous visions, it is so reminiscent of the discussion of the new economic policy which was introduced in 1970 to deal with serious inequities in the country at that time.
So it seems like we're back at square one. Idlan, I want to ask you if you could just weigh in on the diagnosis that's embedded in the document. And Terence just read out some of the sense of our current situation. Do you agree? Do you think that diagnosis is correct?
I don't disagree at all, in fact. When we look at the language that is in the document, for example, it doesn't seem to be anything markedly new. In fact, if you think about it, shared prosperity has always been arguably our agenda. Even the new economic policy was meant to share prosperity across the board. So in essence, in fact, as Terence pointed out, the document itself actually acknowledges implicitly that the policies that we had in the past didn't achieve, I'm hesitant to use the word failed, but didn't achieve what it intended to achieve.
Terence, could there be any other way of cutting this cake, as it were? Growth with redistribution, growth with equity. Is there any other way that a politician or a government can deliver this message?
The problem here is this. They used the word shared prosperity. And they used that in the context of what happened in the last general election, where they did say very clearly, we are going to move away from race-based policies to one that is needs-based. What I had concerns with is the way they have framed it is in a comparative perspective between the Bumiputras and the non-Bumiputras. Now, that's not our understanding of what we were expecting from this government, which talked about a new vision for Malaysia. We are all in the same boat. We should look at it in terms of how we can collectively lift the economy together. There was no need to take us back into this dichotomy between Bumiputras and non-Bumiputras.
Idlan, what do you think what's happened? I mean, is this a trope or a metaphor that we seem to find ourselves inescapably tied to the Bumiputra, non-Bumiputra competition, rather than seeing Malaysia in terms of its location in the world and the global economy and those challenges? Why is it that we return continually to the Bumiputra, non-Bumiputra issue?
I feel that this is because it's convenient. It's easy. We know this is an issue. It has always been an issue politically, and this is the other problem that I've got with the document, is that as a vision document, it doesn't push the envelope far enough to actually go towards a particular vision. Going back to the trope, the well-trodden tropes is easy, but nothing there gives us much clarity on how we are going to get it right this time. It's just telling us what we already know, but not telling us how we correct the mistakes of the past.
Is that how you see it? Is there a little sense of actually what's going to come out of this?
Well, I would take a different perspective. I would argue that when I saw this document and the more I read of its content, this was a more politically driven document rather than one that was focused on the economic aspects of the country. Why do I say it's politically driven? If you look at the authors too, the authors, when I looked at acknowledgements and a list of authors, it seems to be coming out from one party, Bersatu. That was my main concern. And then I also was concerned about the level of consultation that's going on here. Was there a real consultation? This is, after all, Pakatan Harapan's first major public policy. Was there a real consultation with all segments of society? I'm talking about the private sector, I'm talking about labor, I'm talking also about academics, I'm talking about people in the rural areas. When they prepared Vision 2020, for example, there was a major National Economic Council, and there was a lot of preparation going into Vision 2020. I didn't see this for this document. And to add irony to the situation is we have a new Malaysian Economic Council. I wonder how much the new Malaysian Economic Council had a role to play in this, and what of the committee of eminent people which also knows the state of play of the economy. Did they use those ideas from the CEP to address these issues? So why do I say it's political? I feel when I look at it, and why did they put it in the comparative dimension between Bumiputras and non-Bumiputras? There seems an attempt here to garner as much Bumiputra support as possible. And therein lies the tragedy of this document. It should not have been a political document. It should have been one on economic growth.
I mean, do you agree with Terence? I mean, do you think this is essentially a political document, and do you think it's essentially about Dr. Mahathir putting his stamp on the Pakatan Harapan government's thinking about the economy?
I think it is. I wouldn't completely say it's entirely a political document, but the language, the flex, is a lot more political than the narrative, if you read it. Unfortunately, I've only been treated to the summary. I'm not sure if...
I read the full document.
I wasn't provided with the full document, and it's not easily available online at the moment either. And so the language that we get, the vagueness is, a lot of the vagueness is in the economic stuff. A lot of the clarity for what is in there is the politics. So I don't disagree with that at all.
Right, okay, we'll take a short break. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned to Consider This. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Sharad Kuttan. With me, Terence Gomez and Idlan Zakaria. They're both here to help me understand the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030. Now, we ended on the note about the tone of the document, maybe what it's directed to and what it can achieve. Perhaps, yeah, well, let's look at what it can achieve. Terence, tell me, I mean, are we looking at continuity essentially, or do we see some radical change in terms of the economic gears of society and this administration?
Well, to answer that, I was focusing on their primary objectives and their main thrust. As I said, when we look at the primary objectives and the main thrust, it's there. They understand the problems. But what I wanted to understand is also the policy mechanisms as to how they're going to go about doing it. In that sense, they didn't get into it, although they did say, wait for the 12th Malaysia Plan, and then you'll see more of this, or how we're going to do it. This is just the vision. Now, my concern with the vision is this. They don't necessarily use the word, but it appears to be running through the document, the idea of affirmative action. The idea of affirmative action seems to be the main thrust, to continue to find a mechanism to lift Bumiputras out of what they say they are mired in, still in the bottom 40%. They are not part of the corporate sector. These are issues which are well cited in this document. My concern with affirmative action is this. If they want to use that as a policy mechanism, the first thing they should have done was review the past years. They've had this policy since 1970. Now, what lessons can we learn from the implementation of the NEP since 1970? We do know one thing. It did help reduce poverty appreciably. And the other thing which it did was through education, they helped create a new middle class, a vibrant Bumiputra middle class. The NEP was quite successful, I would say, in the first 10 years. There was a shift later to business. When affirmative action focused on business, the lessons are very clear. They have not been successful. This document admits it. But interestingly, the focus is on the business aspects. And instead of thinking of how to redress the problems that are very clear to us, we've created a crutch mentality, as Mahathir has said, a dependency syndrome. How do we get past it? There's no response to that. In fact, it seems to be more of the same that's coming out of this.
Right, so doubling down on the issue of corporate equity and ownership and stuff. I mean, how did you read this? I mean, do you see that essentially this document is centered on the question of affirmative action? Is it addressing the Malay ground more than the kind of Malaysian ground, as it were?
It's a very interesting question, Sharad, because on the website, if you go to the Makmur Bersama 2030 website, there's a quote from Tun Mahathir, if I could just, it's in Malay. So he goes to say, rakyat yang bersatu tanpa prasangka dengan meraihkan kepelbagaian bangsa dan budaya adalah asas penyatuan negara bangsa, dan matlamat kemakmuran bersama adalah untuk menyediakan taraf hidup yang wajar kepada semua rakyat Malaysia. That's a big quote on the website. I don't see that in the language of the document here. How is this rakyat bersatu tanpa prasangka? How are you going to be achieving this aspect of nation building? As Terence pointed out, it's talking about the corporate side, but the country is more than just the businesses. It's about the people. Where is the people in this? If it's a shared prosperity, if it's about everybody, where is the people in this?
Okay, how else would this as a document in terms of economic issues, and I think that is perhaps your concern too, how does it relate to other documents like the Industrial Master Plan 3 and all these other plans that we've had for re-gearing the economy? I mean, Terence, is there any sense that this document is concerned about addressing the bottlenecks or the structural weaknesses in Malaysia that don't allow us to achieve the aspirations that are articulated?
Well, that's a good point, Sharad. If you look at the 9th Malaysia Plan, for example, and the 10th Malaysia Plan, I want to focus on those two because they were under different prime ministers. 9th was under Abdul Ahmad Badawi and the 10th was under Najib Razak. In the 9th Malaysia Plan, there was a shift towards helping small and medium-scale enterprises. Now that is important because they constitute 98% of the corporate sector by the government's own admission. If you look at Najib's plan, Najib talked about a new economic model, and Najib brought it up in 2009 in response to the 2008 global financial crisis. So clearly both of them were admitting that there was major structural problems that needed to be addressed. Now what's the difference here? SMEs, on one hand, had to be the focus. That's true. The second thing that Abdullah spoke about was the public delivery system. Even if we have good policies, you must have a good institutional framework. The bureaucracy must not only be able to develop the policies, they must also be able to deliver the policies. That was a major structural flaw. In the 10th Malaysia Plan, I would argue Najib did try to look at that. And one of his major differences in terms of others was he created an institution called Pemandu. Pemandu was supposed to come up with the new policy directions, taking it out of the frame of the public sector. But the big problem was also, again, implementation. So that's why I looked to this document to see whether they understood two things. One, how much are we helping the SMEs? They constitute 98% of the corporate sector. Second, how much is there in terms of reforming the public sector to become an effective public sector to deliver the policies?
Public sector, hot potato, isn't it? A big, hot, steaming potato in the Malaysian landscape. Lan, what do you think? I mean, can this government be much more kind of focused on reforming the delivery system?
I think the government can do quite a lot with this, but what from our very limited perch as a think tank, what we're hearing is that a lot of these policies are prescriptive top-down. There isn't a lot that is moving in the other direction. So these policies, the public sector, if you're trying to reform anything of that nature, you've got to kind of start talking to the parties that you are trying to reform, to bring back up to wherever you need it to be. I mean, if you look at the public sector, right now people are talking, for example, about pension reform, which is a big thing in terms of saving money for the government. But in terms of the will of taking it forward, the clarity of the plan, the communication about this is where I think the government can still improve.
Terence, you want to jump in there?
Yes, I would like to respond to the point, to the question that you just raised. Can the public sector or public institutions play a role to deal with the problems that were raised in this document? Now, one key point which was raised was about regional diversity, inequalities in terms of regional diversity. So, for example, we see great growth rates in the industrialized states in the southern coast of the peninsula, FT also, but we see great poverty in the northern parts of the peninsula as well as in the Borneo states. Does the government have an institutional framework to help them? Yes, they do. I'm talking about statutory bodies, KESEDA, KETENGA. These are institutions which have grassroots right down to the bottom, and those are the people we need to help, the really rural poor, where we know there's hardcore poverty. The question I was looking for is, are they using that institutional framework that is already there, especially through the Ministry of Rural and Regional Development, to help redress these problems? Those are mechanisms in place which, if they use it effectively, can be done. But I didn't see that. I didn't see effective use of these things.
We'll take another short break. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned to Consider This. Welcome back to Consider This. I'm Sharad Kuttan. With me, Idlan Zakaria, CEO of the Centre, and Terence Gomez, Professor of Political Economy at University of Malaya. We're talking about the Shared Prosperity Vision 2030 document. There's a lot in it, and I know a lot of it's controversial. Terence, Bumiputra equity, again, has come up as a way of measuring shared prosperity. Is this the right yardstick?
I think it's about time the country moved away from any discussion about the 30% figure. It's really outdated. But since they brought it up and they put it back on the table, we have no choice but to discuss it. But let's look at this from a historical perspective. When they introduced the NEP, the equity, I have the figures here before me. This is very important. In 1970, the volume of equity owned by Bumiputras and trust agencies was only 2.4%. It went up during the NEP period at the end of 1990 to 19.2%, and it continued to rise to about 22%, we were told, in the year 2011. Since then, according to this document, it has fallen behind and has fallen appreciably. And so they are saying now we got to do something about this. But I'd like to put this back on the table. Let's look at the non-Bumiputra segment. The non-Bumiputras owned in 1970 27%. It went up to the high point, 45% in 1990, and now we are told it's down to about 34% and falling. That means even for non-Bumiputras, they're falling behind. Just as the Bumiputras have fallen behind, the non-Bumiputras have fallen behind. And this is very troublesome, because what does it mean in terms of domestic investors investing in the economy? They're not investing, which is why they're also falling behind.
So they're falling behind to whom? I mean, who's taking the lion's share of the economy? Who's in control of it or has ownership of it? Very good point, because what is on the ascendancy is foreign firms. And again, we go back in history. According to the figures, the tables clearly indicate in 1970, foreigners owned 63.4% of the corporate sector. Now, it reached its lowest point in 1990, 25%. And since then, it has been rising steadily.
And today we are told it's about 40%, 45% in fact. It's reaching 50% of the economy. Now I'm worried, and I just want to close on this point. Who are these foreigners also are coming in? What I looked for in the document, which I felt we had to put on the table too, is the role of China. China is the key new player in the economy, and Chinese investments are coming. That's our current research. They're also coming in a big way. How does China's coming in and these foreign investors coming in through state-owned enterprises from China fit into this framework that we are talking about?
Okay. One of the things that we've come to accept about Malaysia is democratic, or at least it had the form of it, and perhaps now we're going to give it some substance since the elections of last year. But we're also a capitalist economy, and one that's fairly globalized and fairly open. Is it a problem that so much of the economy is owned or controlled by foreign business and corporate interests? I mean, is ownership and the identity of the owners really what we should be looking at, or rather the nature of the kind of investments we're getting, and the nature, are they building a strong economy, are they creating resilience, is there complexity, are they creating jobs? Idlan, what do you think?
I think the question that I would perhaps put out is, who are these foreign investors? Are they foreign corporations, or are they foreign state investors? For example, China, as Terence pointed out, they are doing this in a big way everywhere. For example, they go to Africa, for example, and say, you know, if you let us, you get your oil in Angola, for example, we will build you your railroads, etc., etc. That is a state type of investment. It's not a corporate body from, you know, this is not a PLC from the UK deciding to invest 25% in Malaysia. So I think there needs to be a clarity on who is actually investing. Is it a state investment? In which case, I'd probably be quite wary of that. If it's normal corporate investment, I would probably be saying that that might be a little bit more healthy in terms of how people see our economy.
Right, so because state investors might come with other strategic interests, is that what you're...
Other strategic interests, other perhaps potential motives or new forms of colonization that...
Oh my God, the neo-colonialism. Okay, but Terence, I mean, really, should we be concerned about the identity of, you know, of the money that comes that it invests? I mean, as opposed to, as I suggested, you know, what they actually, the consequence of that investment.
I'd like to take this point further. When China comes in, they're driven primarily by state-owned enterprises. Malaysia's economy also has got a lot of GLCs, which are also key players in the economy. Here we must look at the role of the state. Two government leaders can talk to each other, and the Malaysian government, I would have thought, would play a clear role in dictating also the terms of entry here. So for example, if you have more joint ventures, if there's a clear stress on transfer of technology through these joint ventures, it can be productive for both sides, I would argue. So our Malaysian firms also can learn from this joint venture, and they have good technology which they can transfer to us. Look at the case of Geely and what they've done with Proton. They can help the economy grow. But we have to be very clear that when we allow these foreign investors to come in, domestic investors or domestic firms must also be part of this process. That's what I was concerned about. I don't see enough of that happening.
But what kind of, I mean, honestly, what kind of leverage does Malaysia have? They're regional competitors, you know, many other countries in the region willing to accept Chinese money, perhaps lowering, you know, barriers to entry and, you know, facilitating that. Does Malaysia really have a choice? Can it? Is it an equal negotiator at the table, Idlan? What do you think?
I mean, we've got to accept the fact that we are a small economy, but that doesn't mean we can't push back where we can. Again, there are limitations to what we can do, and there's got to be something in it for us as a country, and we've got to be aware of what, and this is about transparency, knowing from the get-go what is it that we are giving up and what is it that we are getting in return.
Terence, I mean, your final thoughts are on some of, so we talked about some of the issues around, you know, the international challenges, but domestic structural problems, do you think this document addresses? I mean, are we honest about what needs to be done?
My primary concern is this: if it is supposed to be an inclusive document, does this document generate ideas that domestic investors, especially in non-Bumiputras, will say, I have faith in this government. I do believe it's inclusive, and I want to be part of this agenda that they have. I'm afraid I don't see it, because it's a repetition of old policies which bypass domestic firms. You said just now, what is our strength? I would argue we have a vibrant SME base. That is our strength. But we cannot have this situation of ethnic bypass through these kinds of discourses. The inclusiveness should have been how to incorporate them into this. We have a vendor development program. Can we bring them in with the FDI that's coming in? Those are the things that I want to see, but I'm not seeing it. The second issue, and we have to get into this also, but we don't have time on it, is education. Now, we may say education is in a bad state, but we have a vibrant middle class. We have a middle class which is well educated. This middle class can also be part of this process too. I didn't see any attempt to bring that middle class, that educated middle class also into this process. Those are the key weaknesses I feel of this document.
Thank you so much, both of you, for being with me on the show. I've been speaking to Terence Gomez, who's a professor of political economy at University of Malaya, and Idlan Zakaria. She's with the Centre. That's all we have for you on Consider This tonight. I'm Shoaib Kuttan, only for Astro Awani.